Good morning and welcome to today's study. Today we will be looking at Psalm 55. May our thoughts, our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Psalm 55. Listen, O God, to my prayer. Do not ignore my appeal for mercy. Pay attention to me and answer me. I am so upset and distressed, I am beside myself, because of what the enemy says, because of how the wicked pressure me, for they hurl trouble upon me and angrily attack me. My heart beats violently within me. The horrors of death overcome me. Fear and panic overpower me. Terror overwhelms me. I say, I wish I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and settle in a safe place. Look, I will escape to a distant place. I will stay in the wilderness. I will hurry off to a place that is safe from the strong wind and the gale. Confuse them, O Lord, frustrate their plans, for I see violence and conflict in the city. Day and night they walk around on its walls, while wickedness and destruction are within it. Disaster is within it. Violence and deceit do not depart from its public square. Indeed, it is not an enemy who insults me, or else I could bear it. It is not one who hates me arrogantly, who arrogantly taunts me, or else I could hide from me. But it is you, a man like me, my close friend in whom I confided. We would share personal thoughts with each other. In God's temple we would walk together among the crowd. May death destroy them, may they go down alive into Sheol, for evil is in their dwelling place and their midst. As for me, I will call out to God, and the Lord will deliver me. Evening, morning and noontime, I will lament and moan, and he will hear me. He will rescue me and protect me from those who attack me, even though they greatly outnumber me. God, the one who has reigned as king from long ago, will hear and humiliate them. They refuse to change and do not fear God. He attacks his friends, he breaks his solemn promises to them. His words are as smooth as butter, but he harbours animosity in his heart. His words seem softer than oil, but they are really like sharp swords. Throw your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the godly to be shaken. But you, O God, will bring them down into the deep pit. Violent and deceitful people will not live even half a normal lifespan. But as for me, I trust in you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The situation of the psalmist has a general correspondence with that of David in the period of Absalom's rebellion. The identification of the traitorous friend with Ahithophel is naturally suggested by these words. But there are some considerable difficulties in the way of taking that view. The psalmist is evidently in the city from which he longs to escape. But Ahithophel's treachery was not known to David until after his flight. Would the king have described his counsellor, however much he would have trusted him, as a man might equal? The doubt respecting the identity of this traitor, however, does not seriously militate against the ordinary view of the date and occasion of the psalm, if we suppose that it belongs to the period immediately before the outburst of the conspiracy, whilst David may still have been in Jerusalem. but seeing the treason growing daily bolder, beginning to contemplate flight. The singularly passive attitude which he maintained during the years of Absalom's plotting was due to the consciousness of his guilt and his submission to this punishment. Hitzig ascribes the psalm to Jeremiah, principally on the grounds of the resemblance to the prophet's wish for a lodge in the wilderness, chapter 9 verse 2, to the psalmist's yearning that we read in verses 6 to 8. Chain brings it down to the Persian period, Olshausen to the Maccabean. But the Davidic authorship has at least as much to say for itself as any of these slightly more offbeat conjectures. The psalm may be regarded as divided into 3 parts, each of which carries a different phase of agitated feeling, but not exclusively. Strong excitement does not marshal emotions or their expression according to the artistic proprietaries of sequence, and this psalm is charged with emotion. The vehemence of this emotion accounts for both the occasional obscurity and the manifest lack of strict accuracy in the flow of thought, without any assumption of dislocation of parts or piecing it with fragments of other psalms. Where the heart is writhing within and tumultuous feelings are knocking at the door of the lips, the words are going to be troubled and heaped together, and dominant thoughts may tend to repeat themselves in defiance of any logical continuity. But still, complaint and longing sound through the wailing, yearning notes of the first 8 verses. Hot indignation and terrible imprecations in the stormy central portion, and a quieter, calmer note of confidence and hope, through which, however, from time to time the indignation of the middle surges through again and is audible in the closing verses. The psalmist pictures his emotions in the first part, but with one reference to their cause and but one verse of petition. He begins indeed with asking that his prayer may be heard, and it is well when a troubled heart can raise itself above the sea of trouble to stretch out a hand to grasp toward God. Such an effort of faith already prophesies firm footing on the safe shore. But a very pathetic and true to the experience of many a sorrowing heart is the psalmist's immediate subsequent collapsing onto his griefs. There is a dumb sorrow, there is one which unpacks its heart in many words and does not know when to stop. The psalmist is distracted in his bitter brooding on his troubles. The word means to move restlessly, may apply either to body or mind, and perhaps even to both. For Eastern demonstrative is not paralysed, but stimulated to bodily tokens by sorrow. He can do nothing but groan or moan, his heart writhes within him. Like an avalanche, deadly terrors have fallen upon him and crushed him. Fear and trembling have pierced his inner being, and horror, a rare word which can be rendered as darkness, wraps him around or covers him like a cloak. It is not so much the pressure of pressed evil as the shuddering anticipation of a heavier storm about to burst, which is indicated by these pathetic expressions. The cause of them is stated in a single verse, 3. The voice of the enemy, rather than his hand, is mentioned first, since threats and reproaches precede assaults, and it is a budding rather than full-blown enmity which is in view. The oppression of the second part of verse 3 is an imperfect parallelism with voice, and the conjectural emendation of cries adopted by Chain is tempting. They fling down iniquity on him like rocks are hurled or rolled from a height on invaders. A phrase which recalls David's words to his servants, urging flight before Absalom, lest he brings down evil upon us. Then, from out of all this plaintive description of the psalmist's agitation and its causes, starts up that immortal strain which answers to the deepest longings of the soul, and has touched responsive chords in all whose lives are not hopelessly outward and superficial. The yearning for peace. It may be ignoble, lofty, or pure. It may mean only cowardice or indolence, but it is deepest in those who stand most unflinchingly at their posts, crushing it down in the name of duty. Unless a soul knows that yearning for a home in stillness, afar from the sphere of our sorrow, it will remain a stranger to many high and noble things. The psalmist was moved to utter this longing by his painful consciousness of surrounding evil. But the longing is more than the desire for exemption from these. It is the cry of a homeless soul, which, like the dove from the ark, finds no resting place in a world full of waste, and would rather return whence it came. O God, you have made us for yourself, and we are unquiet until we find your rest. No obligation of duty keeps migratory birds in a land where winter is near. But men are better than birds, because they have other things to think of than repose, and must face and not flee storms and hurricanes. It is better to have wings like birds of the tempest-loving kind, and to beat up against the wind, rather than try to outfly it in retreat. And so the psalmist's wish was but a wish, and he, like the rest of us, had to stand to his post, or be tied to his stake, and let the enemies and storms do their worst. Chain has adopted a striking reading of verse 8. A waiting for him who saves me. But beautiful as this is, giving the picture of the restful fugitive in a patient expectation, it brings an entirely new idea into the picture and blends metaphor and fact in confusion. The close of verse 7 deepens the sense of still repose by a prolonged instrumental interlude. The second part of today's psalm turns from subjective feelings to objective fact. A cry for help and a yearning for safe solitude were natural results of the former. But when the psalmist's eyes turn to his enemies, there is a glimmer of anger, and instead of the meek longings of the earlier verses, prayers for their destruction are poured out vehemently. The state of things in the city correspond to what must have been the condition of Jerusalem during the incubation of Absalom's conspiracy. It is, however, sufficiently general to fit any time of strained feelings. The cauldron is simmering and is ready to boil over. The familiar evils of which so many psalms complain are in full vigour. The psalmist enumerates them with a wealth of words which indicate their abundance. Violence, strife, iniquity, mischief, oppression and deceit. A goodly company to patrol the streets and fill up the open places of the city. Verse 10 is sometimes taken as carrying on the personification of violence and strife in verse 9 by painting them as going on their rounds on the wall like sentries. But perhaps it is better to suppose that actual foes are meant, and that they are keeping up a strict watch to prevent the psalmist's escape. Several commentators Consider that the burst of indignation against the psalmist's traitorous friend, verses 12 to 14, interrupts the sequence, and propose rearrangements by which verses 20 to 21 are coupled to 12 to 14 and are placed either before verse 6 or after verse 15. But the very abruptness with which the thought of the traitor is interjected here, and in the subsequent reference to him, indicates how the singer's heart was obsessed by the treason, and the return to the subject in verse 20 is equally significant of his absorbed and pained brooding on that bitter fact. That is a slight pain which is removed by one cry. Rooted grief, overwhelming sorrow demand many repetitions. Trouble finds ease in tautology. It is absurd to look for cool, logical sequencing in such a heart's cry as today's psalm. Smooth continuity would be somewhat unnatural. The psalmist feels that the defection of his false friend is the worst blow of all. He could have braced himself to bear an enemy's envy and anger. He could have found weapons to repel or a shelter in which to escape from open foes. But the baseness which forgets all sweet companionship in former times, in secret, and in all association in public and worship, is more than he can bear. The voice of his wounded love is too plain in the words for the hypothesis that the singer is the personified nation. Traitors are too common to be able to provide a confident affirmation that the psalm truly points to Ahithophel, and the description of the perfidious friend as the equal of the psalmist somewhat jars with this case. As he thinks of all the sweetness of past intimacy turned to gall by such dastardly treachery, his anger is fanned. The description of the city and of the one enemy in whom all its wickedness is, as it were, concentrated, is framed in a terrible circlet of prayer for the destruction of foes. Verse 9 begins and verse 15 ends this part with petitions that do not breathe the spirit of Father, forgive them. There may be a reference to the confusion of tongues at Babel in the prayer of verse 9, as then the impious work was stopped by mutual unintelligibility. So the psalmist desires that his enemies' machinations be paralyzed in the same way. In verse 15, the translation desolation follows the Hebrew text, while the alternative and in some respects preferable reading, may death follow suddenly, is in the Hebrew marginal correction. But there are difficulties in both translations, and the correction does not so much smooth the language as to be clearly an improvement. The general sense is clear, whichever reading we may prefer. The psalmist calls down destruction on his enemies, while the fact that he is in some manner an organ of divine purpose invests hostility to him with the darker character of rebellion against God, and therefore modifies the personal element in the prayer. It still remains a plain instance of the lower level on which the Old Testament saints and singers stood, when compared with the least in the kingdom of heaven. The third part of the psalm returns to gentler tones of devotion and trust. The great name of Jehovah appears here significantly. To that ever-living one, the covenant God, will the psalmist cry in assurance of answer. Evening, morning, and noon designate the whole day by its three principal divisions, and mean, in effect, continually. Happy are the ones who are compelled to unceasing prayer by the sight of sleepless enmity. Enemies may go on their rounds by day and night, but they will do little harm if the poor hunted man, whom they watch so closely, lifts his cry to heaven, evening, morning and noon. The psalmist returns to his first words. He had begun by saying he was distracted as he thought, and could do nothing but moan. In verse 17, he repeats that he will still do so. Has he then won nothing by his prayer but the prolongation of his first dreary tone of feeling? He has won this, that his thoughts are not accompanied by distraction, that his groaning is not involuntary expression of pain, but articulate prayer, and therefore accompanied by the confidence of being heard. Communion with God and prayerful trust in his help do not at once end sadness and sobbing, but they do change their character and lighten the blackness of grief. The psalmist, like so many of his fellows, realizes deliverance before he experiences, and can sing, "He has redeemed my soul even while the calamity continues." They may not come near me, he says. A soul hidden in God has an invisible defence which repels assaults. As with a man in a diving bell, the sea may press in on the crystal walls, but cannot crush them in or enter, and there is a safe, dry lodging inside, while the sea billows and monsters are without, close to the diver and yet far from him in practical terms. Verse 19 is full of difficulty for us and most probably has suffered some textual corruption over the centuries. To hear and to answer is uniformly an expression for gracious hearing and beneficent answering. Here it can only mean the opposite, or it must perhaps be used ironically. God will hear the enemy's threats and will requite them. Various suggestions have been made for removing this difficulty. It has been proposed that we read me instead of them, which would bring everything into order, only that then the last clause of the verse, which begins with the relative who have no changes, would want something else added as well. It has been proposed that we read will humble them for will answer them. That requires a change in the vowels of the verb, and answer is more probable than humble after here. Chain follows the suggestion of Olshausen in supposing that the cry out of the afflicted has dropped out after here. The construction of verse 19 is somewhat anomalous, as the clause is introduced by a superfluous and, which may perhaps be a copying error. It is difficult to explain the pause at this point, in view of the relative which begins the third clause, and which should otherwise be naturally kept close to the previous part. There is probably, again, some considerable corruption of the text that needs perhaps to be remedied, but the existing reading is at least capable of being explained and defended. The principal difficulty in the final part of verse 19 is the meaning of the word rendered changes. The people spoken of are those whom God will hear and answer in his judicial character, in which he has been throned of old. Their not having changes is closely connected with their not fearing God. The word is used otherwise for changes of raiment or for the relief of military guards. Calvin and many others take the changes to mean the vicissitudes of fortune, and so draw the true thought that the unbroken prosperity tends to forgetfulness of God. Others take the changes to be those of mind or conduct from evil to God, good, while others fall back on the metaphor of relieving the guard, which they connect with the picture in verse 10 of the patrols on the walls, and so creating the meaning that they have no ceasing and their wicked watchfulness. It should be acknowledged that none of these meanings is quite satisfactory, but perhaps the first, which expresses the familiar thought of the godlessness attendant upon uninterrupted prosperity, is best. We then switch back to another reference to the traitorous friend, which by its very abruptness declares how deep the wound is that has been inflicted. The psalmist does not stand alone. He classes himself with those who remain around him, faithful to him. The traitor has not yet thrown off his mask, though the psalmist has penetrated his still retained disguise. He comes with smooth words, but in the vigorous language of verse 21, his heart is war. The fawning softness of words known to be false cuts his heart, which are trusted and knows itself to be betrayed, more sharply than the sharpest of steel. Verse 22 has been taken as the smooth words which did cut so deep. But surely that is a very strained interpretation. Rather, the psalmist exhorts himself and all who have the same bitterness to taste, to commit themselves wholeheartedly to Jehovah. What is it that he exhorts us to cast upon him? The word employed is used here only, and its meaning is therefore somewhat debatable. Some translate care, others, relying on the Talmud, prefer burden, which is appropriate to the following promise of being held erect. Others read that which he has given you. The general sense is clear, and the faith expressed both in the exaltation and the appended promise has been won by the singer through his prayer. He is counselling and encouraging himself. The Spirit has to spur the soul to heroism of faith and patience. He is declaring a universal truth by doing this. However crushing our loads of duty or sorrow, we receive strength to carry them with a straight back, if we cast them upon Jehovah. The promise is not that he will take away the burden, but that he will support us under it. And similarly, the last clause declares that the righteous will not be allowed to stumble. Faith is mentioned before righteousness. The two must go together, for trust which is not accompanied and manifested by righteousness is not true trust, and righteousness which is not grounded in trust is neither stable nor true righteousness. The last verse sums up the various fates of these men of blood and deceit and of the psalmist. The terrible prayers of the middle portion of the psalm have wrought the assurance of their fulfilment, just as the cries of faith have brought the certainty of theirs. So the two closing verses of the psalm turn both parts of the earlier petitions into prophecy, and over against the trustful, righteous psalmist standing erect and unmoved, there is set the picture of the man of blood and deceit chased down the black slopes to the depths of destruction by the same God, whose hand holds up the man that trusts in him. This is truly a dreadful contrast, and the spirit of the whole psalm is gathered up in it. The last clause of all makes the I emphatic. It expresses the final resolution which springs in the singer's heart in view of that dread picture of destruction and those assurances of support. He recoils from the edge of the pit, eagerly opening his bosom for the promised blessing. How well it is for us if the upshot of our meditations on the painful riddle of this unintelligible world, and of all our burdens and experiences, and of our observation of other men's careers, is the absolute determination we find, as for me, I will trust in Jehovah. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.